At the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of State Marco Rubio did less of announcing new policy decisions, and he did more of kind of redefining the new American worldview or America's view on foreign policy. So, if you strip away kind of the rhetoric and outside stigma about his speech, he actually does make some points about sovereignty, trade, alliance structure, and national identity. I agree with parts of it, I disagree with parts of it, so let's go through it carefully.
That the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world. This was a foolish idea that ignored both human nature and it ignored the lessons of over 5,000 years of recorded human history. And it has cost us dearly.
Rubio argues that we cannot put the interests of the international institutions in front of our national interests, and to an extent, I do agree. Institutions like the United Nations, I feel, especially in recent years, have done little but put forward strongly worded resolutions and condemnations rather than actually solving problems. When you look at Ukraine and Gaza, well, Marco Rubio is essentially right to some extent that it took a lot of these independent nations just working together outside of these international bodies to bring the negotiators to the table when it comes to like Ukraine and Russia. And with Israel and Palestine, even though there's a really fragile truce going on, without the United States' mediation, we don't know if that really would have happened. But the important nuance here is that international institutions should not be dictating national policy, what independent nations are doing. What they should be doing is they should be helping to coordinate nations to work together on certain things. So we should be using multilateralism and plurilateralism as tools rather than authorities that are ordered by a certain international body. So yes, we should definitely prioritize national interests. Cooperation can amplify those national interests. So it doesn't mean we need to act by ourselves all the time. The problem here isn't really international coordination, but the problem comes when there's constraint on that international cooperation because of dictation from these big international bodies that just want to sit it out and watch what goes on.
Shuttering our plants, resulting in large parts of our societies being deindustrialized, shipping millions of working and middle-class jobs overseas, and handing control of our critical supply chains to both adversaries and rivals.
In this next clip, he frames deindustrialization as a policy choice, and I partly agree, but I would kind of refine his statement. So, I am a strong believer in free trade. I think I've said that in previous videos. And I believe specialization and global commerce are very powerful tools and they can help a lot of different nations. It should actually be able to help every nation because it can create growth, efficiency, and innovation. And it can help these nations help each other through doing what's best for them and then exporting it to other countries. So I'm definitely not against free trade. However, purely perfect free trade only works when it's reciprocal. So in this current global environment, you have certain nations that put protective barriers on their goods or on their services. And with the United States, for quite a long time, we kind of operated without any protective barriers of our own, which ended up putting us in deficits and things of that nature. So, like I said, when other nations decide to protect their industries with tariffs and subsidies and the state-owned enterprises, and we don't, it kind of puts us at a little bit of disadvantage. It's no longer free trade. It's kind of just discounted trade from us. And a good example of this is China's kind of monopolization of their control of their exports, where they've been able to essentially weaponize the supply chain. And it's not like it was an automatic thing. It wasn't inevitable. It's a calculated policy, which does threaten the Western way of life. And it kind of stopped being an economic policy or an economic theory. Now you're seeing the kind of an intertwining between economic policy and defense policy, which now makes all of these things kind of national security issues. So the issue here isn't about the idea of trade itself, but kind of we can't be naive and we can't keep our trade just wide open for anyone to trade with us without being there to protect our industry and also doing what's best overall for ourselves and our national interests.
And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe.
Now, this is one of the most viral clips of this speech. In this, Marco Rubio kind of signals the idea that America is taking the conditional leadership approach, that we're going to do this alone if we have to. And I agree that alliance members have to carry their own weight. And the goal of an alliance is so that it's a bunch of nations that can fend for themselves working together to defend a common goal. You shouldn't really have any nations relying on the one big nation to protect it. It's an alliance. It's not really like a sphere of influence, a sphere of defense influence thing. But the burden sharing isn't necessarily the 2% GDP, for example, with NATO, because countries will contribute in a lot of different ways with intelligence, logistics, sanctions, their diplomatic leverage, and just overall their regional presence being in different parts of the world. And I believe that just because the United States pulls the most weight, and I think we're going to continue to do so, I don't think that it gives us blanket decision making abilities where we should be able to dictate everyone around us and our allies should kind of bend to our will. However, I do believe that since the United States does pull a lot of the weight and it does do the bulk of the work, that America acting in its own national interest when it doesn't come at a mass expense of its allies is rational. I think it's rational, and I think it makes sense because the most powerful one in the group, especially the one who's kind of leading the charge, the one that's leading what's going on, they naturally should have more say. But the fine line kind of gets drawn around that when we just assume leadership for ourselves, because leadership will be the strongest when it's kind of entrusted to us, when it's entrusted to us as a country rather than us imposing it ourselves. And if we really want the strongest possible alliance, like NATO, like for NATO, for example, we need reciprocity. We don't need a hierarchy based on power or influence within the group unless it's agreed upon. Unless it's agreed upon. But every nation should be contributing their fair share and defending themselves.
Is what exactly are we defending? Because armies do not fight for abstractions. Armies fight for a people. Armies fight for a nation. Armies fight for a way of life. And that is what we are defending. A great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history, confident of its future, and aims to always be the master of its own economic and political.
Now, this is kind of where we get into the frisky territory. This part of the speech kind of echoes the rhetoric that we saw from JD Vance last year in Munich and from other kind of this new wave of American or Western populism, which is the idea that we are defending a way of life. And the danger here is that it can easily drift into culture war. And I think it's something that's misinterpreted or misattributed a lot of the time. Not really misattributed, but it's an incorrect interpretation of the idea. And I think some of these speakers are even doing it. But when we're talking about defending a way of life, when we're talking about the military going out and defending a way of life, defending the Western way of life, we're talking about defending the constitutional system, the rule of law, individual liberty, democracy, and political self determination. However, there is the danger from the populist group, which decides to move this into kind of the culture war territory, that it's an us against them idea, that our Western way of life versus the Eastern way of life, those two cultures are at war. Not the political systems, not the governmental systems we have set up, but rather our cultures itself. We're doing it's a cultural war. Adding on to that, there are parts of this speech which I do not like. There's parts of this speech which I didn't love, especially some of the language which kind of it sounded like you're celebrating Western expansion and colonial history. You kind of romanticize it in a sense, talking about these great big empires, and we need to move forward from that. I think that alliance politics, especially in the West, should be less about glorifying the past or antagonizing non-Western countries, especially because some of the actions taken by Western alliances have created dire situations in developing and third world countries. And a lot of these countries are outside of our sphere of influence. So the idea here that the global south, which is essentially growing, I'm not necessarily talking about the China aligned bloc or the Russia aligned bloc, but some of these nations which are growing, we shouldn't interpret that as these nations are actually trying to challenge the West or take the West mantle. These nations are trying to do what's best for them because after hundreds of years of colonial exploitation and things like that, of course there were some good, some bad. The effects that colonialism left on some of these lands was it was really destructive, and it's really poor. And we can't look at it as it's an us against them thing once again, because yes, we do have enemies in the global south and the Eastern world. China, we're not really aligned. I mean, before Maduro was deposed, you had people like Venezuela. You have Russia, obviously. You have Iran. But the idea there is that not all of the countries that aren't Western are our adversaries. We can't look at it that way because, again, global cooperation, we're talking about multilateralism, pluralism. Some of these nations have things that we may want, and it would be worth it to cooperate with them on. However, that shouldn't come at the expense or endangerment of democracy, political self determination, and civic identity. We shouldn't be trying to treat the global stage as a civilizational battlefield. We are all humans at the end of the day. There are geopolitical disagreements, but that's very dangerous. It's not the way it should be. And in reality, we should be treating it as a negotiation table where we can build alliances that are based on shared interest, not just nostalgia over the empires of the past. I guess overall, kind of looking at this from, I feel like in this case, I'm kind of adopting a small L libertarian standpoint. I think a few guiding principles here would be, of course, national sovereignty matters. Um, Military force should be used carefully and with a clear purpose. I don't think that was really indicated by the administration officials that were at the Munich Security Conference. However, I do believe that. I think that trade should be open and not fair. I think that was, or sorry, trade should be open but fair. I think that was indicated by our officials. Again, I think this administration has done a good job at pointing out problems, certain problems. They've done this in some cases where it comes to like trade and some of the issues that are going on globally. However, I don't like their approach to it. Like I don't like blanket tariffs, for example. I don't think the calculation is correct. And I think there's a statistic. It was I forgot who did the study, but it's like 97% of that tariff has essentially been paid by the American consumer. That's for another video. But has echoed in this kind of through this meeting and kind of my take on it. I think that alliances should be there to serve the people, not just bureaucracies. I think that it's a great step forward that the United Nations has kind of done their first ever budget cut and they've let go of a few thousand bureaucrats. I mean, of course, I hope those people find jobs, etc. But I think it's good to start downsizing those groups if they're not actually going to put out any results or if they're not actually going to do anything. Because we're at a point where, 4 years of war and almost 4 years of war in Gaza and 5 years of war. I think we're coming up on the 5 year anniversary in these coming days. 5 years of war in Ukraine, and the United Nations hasn't done much. They've sent observers, sure. They've written a few resolutions, but they haven't actually reached a solution on these problems.
Give us your expectation. Are you optimistic? Can there be a quote-unquote deal with China? What do you expect?
Well, I would say this. The two largest economies in the world, two of the big powers on the planet, we have an obligation to communicate with them and talk, and so do many of you on a bilateral basis as well. I mean, it would be geopolitical malpractice to not be in conversations with China. I would say this, because we're two large countries with huge global interests, our national interests will often not align. Their national interests and ours will not align, and we owe it to the world to try to manage those as best we can, obviously avoiding conflict, both economic and worse. And so it's important for us to have communications with them in that regard. On areas in which our interests are aligned, I think we can work together to make positive impact on the world, and we seek opportunities to do that with them. But we have to have a relationship with China, and many of the countries represented here today are going to have a relationship with China, always understanding that nothing that we agree to could come at the expense of our national interest. And frankly, we expect China to act in their national interest, as we expect every nation state to act in their national interest. And the goal of diplomacy is to try to navigate those times in which our national interests come into conflict with one another.
Now I'm kind of going to move forward to the Q&A, which was at the end of the video of Marco Rubio. And I think his framing on China was very pragmatic because he kind of acknowledged that there are conflicting national interests overall, but he tried to emphasize communication between the bloc that's standing against the Chinese bloc. And I think it's very realistic. It's natural that these two major powers are going to compete. It's natural that the United States and China are going to compete. And the goal of diplomacy is to manage that competition peacefully. We don't want to escalate to the point where there's military combat. And the trade wars that are going on right now, while they do spike tension, I think that's natural. I think we should try to work to a point where the consumer doesn't really have to bear the the blunt or the brunt of these trade wars, but I think that Marco Rubio put forward kind of a sober, safe approach towards that issue. Diving into that a little bit more, what he said is kind of signifying that the United States is not seeking a kind of decoupling, nor is it kind of trying to pretend that there's alignment that's supposed to happen. We can't really align on everything naturally, but we are structurally competing with China on things like artificial intelligence, semiconductor production, and influence in the global south. And that competition is not necessarily ideological in a Cold War sense. It's more economical, technological, and strategic because of the combating interests between both sides. So, where I think Rubio is correct is that trade with China cannot be treated as purely economic when the Chinese state does use industrial policy, export control, subsidies, and things as a calculated geopolitical move in order to gain leverage over Western nations. But when rare earth minerals, battery supply chains, or semiconductor inputs can be restricted for political reasons, there's no longer reasons for just a trade imbalance. You're actually looking at a strategic vulnerability. There's a reason why a lot of geopolitical analysts say that if China takes over Taiwan, then they'll move forward as the strongest nation in the world because they have so much control over semiconductors. And that's the reason why kind of our competition with China is so important. The nuance comes when you're kind of talking about how we don't necessarily want economic severance with China because of this competition. Because if we really did, if we really cut off our economic ties with China, which I think this is pretty obvious, but it would raise costs domestically, it would completely disrupt the global market, and American exporters would probably take the worst of it, American consumers and American exporters. So the smarter approach will be de-risking. So not necessarily full disengagement, but trying to diversify the supply chain. I know he talked a lot about energy laws and things like that. And I agree. I think it would be very beneficial for Europe and the United States to harvest their own energy and kind of try to find alternate ways where they don't have to rely so much on China and Russia for things like energy or rare earth minerals. I think that we should bring critical industries back to our waters. I think that we should emphasize things on that. We should invest in natural resources that we already have or trade with friendlier allies or friendlier trade partners. We should try to build more plurilateral trade networks with trusted partners. We should look at more influential trade deals that expand trade while protecting our industries. We should maintain the diplomatic channel at all costs to prevent escalation because we, of course, don't want this to escalate any further than it already has. And I think Secretary Rubio kind of reflected this balance. He acknowledged that there are fundamental challenges, but he also emphasized communication and management of friction. And it's realistic. It's realistic diplomacy. The United States and China will continue to compete. That is fact. But the real question is whether that competition will remain structured and manageable or if it becomes escalatory and leads to true conflict. And that will depend on whether economic policy, alliance policy, and military policy remain aligned with clear strategic priorities. So overall, what do I take from this speech? I see a correction to overly idealistic globalization. I see a push for reciprocity and alliances. I see a reassertion of sovereignty and national interest. I see a more strategic view of trade. We'll see how the implementation actually goes, if there's any agreement, any discussion. But as far as the message goes, I'm a fan. And a reminder that defense policy should be connected to civic values. While the framing may be a little bit off, which is where I disagree. I disagree that with their tone and their emphasis, I think that it's a little bit dangerous and populist. But we should understand that our defense policy is connected to our civic values and not quote unquote cultural values that we share. I think that reform is very necessary, but we shouldn't try to antagonize anybody, especially not our allies. And multilateral cooperation and national interests aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Those are two things that can coexist for sure, and it would be very beneficial for all nations involved. And I think Munich this year was a big step up from last year, and I think it actually revealed that multilateralism is coming, or at least some nations are signaling a move towards it.